It can be difficult to write a teenager, especially if it's been a long time since you were a teenager, and sometimes even if you are still a teenager, it can be difficult. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through 9 mistakes, and don't feel bad if you fall into some of these, because guess what? A lot of writers make them. They're very common. If you can avoid these mistakes, you will be on your way to writing a real human being who also happens to be a teenager. And this is the 5th in this series. So far we have covered how to write men, how to write women, how to write children, and how to write animals. So the first mistake that you should avoid at all costs is writing teenagers as though they are either children or adults. Now obviously there are some teenagers who are going to be more mature and some teenagers who are going to be more immature. But ideally you want to strike this nice in-between balance, which is this is a transitional time of life where they are trying to figure out how to become a fully adult human. So your goal really is to try to find that in-between space, that tension between childhood and adulthood. And a good way to do this is simply show your characters wrestling between more childlike activities and more adult activities. In Freaks and Geeks, there's this wonderful tension because the characters are struggling between their desire to go trick-or-treating and the nagging suspicion that they're a little bit too old for it. In Stranger Things, there's this moment where some of the characters are feeling like they're too old to play Dungeons and Dragons, like it's sort of a childish thing. And then one character is like totally into it still. Another good way to navigate this tension between childhood and adulthood is to understand that every single teenage story is a coming-of-age story. It has to be a story of how they are transitioning out of childhood and into adulthood. They are not fully in either camp, they are in that in-between. Look at a book like Divergent by Veronica Roth. We have Triss, who is a timid, self-doubting girl from the Abnegation faction, and she leaves her family and becomes this strong, confident, fiercely independent warrior. For this second mistake, I think I'll get a little bit of pushback, but hear me out on this. Number 2, forgetting acts of rebellion. So most of the time, your teenage character is going to rebel in some way. It might not be a huge way, but there's going to be at least small ways in which they're rebelling against authority figures. And even if your main character is a goody two-shoes and not doing a lot of rebellion, still the ancillary characters, the other teenage characters around them, will be rebelling in some way. I'm talking about things like smoking, drinking, hanging out with the wrong crowd, or physically dangerous stuff like cliff jumping or car racing. But if you're trying to figure out how your teenage character is going to rebel on some level, just remember it doesn't have to be sort of like the cliched acts of rebellion. In Everything Everything by Nicola Maddie, we have a character called Maddie who has a severe autoimmune disorder that makes her allergic to absolutely everything. So for her, an act of rebellion is just leaving her house. Like that's like a crazy thing. So she falls in love with a boy, Ollie, and they end up taking a trip to Hawaii together. Another example would be in Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. For this particular character, rebellion comes in 3 steps. 1, she plays hooky and skips school with her friends. 2, she goes to a Western restaurant that serves burgers and ends up flirting with some boys. And then 3, she smokes a cigarette. But what's interesting in this book is there's a direct comparison between the dictatorship of her mother and the dictatorship of Iran. Ooh, we got some layers there, absolutely. The third mistake is a gigantic omission that you do not want to make. It is number 3, forgetting about authority figures. So there are some books that shove the authority figures to the sidelines. And yes, that gives your characters a lot more freedom, but it also isn't very realistic. One huge step as teenagers transition into adulthood is asserting independence from authority figures. And that means pushing them away and trying to carve out their own individualistic space. I mean, look at a book like Harry Potter. He is an orphan, so right off the bat we get some distance from those parents. They don't exist. But second, we have an adopted family, the Dudleys, and of course he leaves those parental figures. We also have some pretty messy relationships with authority figures at Hogwarts, for instance, with his relationship with Snape. But one thing I'd like to point out is that the relationship to an authority figure is not always negative. Usually there's one authority figure that plays more of a mentorship role and can give advice to the teenage character. In Harry Potter, that would be someone like Dumbledore. In Persepolis, it would be someone like Uncle Anoush, who she really looks up to as this hero that stands up against the Iranian regime. And remember that earning approval from one of those positive authority figures is often one of the steps in a coming-of-age story. Now, the 4th mistake is one that you knew was coming. You knew that I couldn't make this video without talking about it. It is number 4, avoiding technology. Some writers pretend that teenagers use technology far less than they do. Others try to get their teenagers to use a lot of technology, but then they just write it really badly. So the first step is to define your character's relationship to technology. For your particular teenage character, how do they use it? I think a level 1 understanding, like the very basic level understanding, is just having your characters texting, using AI to do homework, or playing video games. I mean, something like John Green's The Fault in Our Stars does a fine job of this level of technology because they connect over email, and also they use social media to connect with the cancer support group. But remember, this was written in 2012. Ages ago, light years ago, eons ago. I think what you should aim for is a level 100 understanding of your teenage character's relationship to technology. And what this is more of a philosophical understanding of their relationship. For instance, what older people tend not to recognize is that the online world is just as real and just as potent of a force in these teenage characters' lives as the real world is. For older people, there's a very distinct hierarchy between like, oh, real world's up here, and like online world, yeah, it kind of exists. For teenagers, like it's more like neck and neck, or sometimes like the online world even seems more important and more real. Things like NFTs don't make sense unless you think that digital objects are just as valuable as real objects. Or things like in-game video purchases don't make sense unless you have that same belief. And if you have that sort of 100 level of understanding of a relationship to technology, you get books like Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, in which the entire plot is structured like an actual video game, and most of the book's existence takes place in this online digital realm rather than in the real world. Now, I should mention an exception that you might be writing in a time period or in a different universe in which there isn't this same technology, and that's completely fine. We see this in books like Maze Runner, where none of the kids have cell phones because there's no way to communicate outside the maze. If you want to do that, that's a perfectly fine exception. So my main point with this is that your teenage character shouldn't ignore technology in general, and that two, don't make technology usage entirely negative. It's a lot more complex than that. Now, this next one is a bit of a spicy one, but it is an essential mistake to avoid. It's number 5, forgetting about sexuality. If you have teenage characters with raging hormones, there's got to be some level of exploration in the novel, even if it's very G-rated. I think one mistake is to show a lot of teens with a lot of swaggering, in-your-face confidence, while the reality is a lot of people at that stage in life have a lot of timidity, have a lot of questions about how good-looking they are. Their entire sexual identity is cloaked in doubt and like trying to figure things out. Let's look at The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. If you took the romantic components out of this novel, there would almost be nothing left. There's Brad, who develops feelings for Patrick, and yet his father hates it, and then he gets bullied at school for it. There is Charlie, who can't initiate a physical relationship with Sam because of childhood sexual trauma. There is Adair to kiss the prettiest woman in the room, and Charlie picks the wrong one, quote unquote. And then there's also Sam's boyfriend, who cheats on her. So I think in most novels with teenagers in them, romance has to be integral to the plot structure of your novel. Another example would be 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. If you examine a list of the 13 reasons that Hannah gave as to why she committed suicide, a lot of them are related to sex. There are illicit images being circled around the school. There is unwanted attention from certain characters. There's a lot of questioning of identities. There is unwanted touching. There is body shaming. There is stalking. I mean, if you take that out of the novel, then the whole novel falls apart. So just make sure when you're writing your book, you have to account for that in the whole social fabric of what's going on in your characters' lives. Now, this next mistake is one you have to make sure you avoid. It is number 6, bowing to stereotypes. So you know the typical categories when it comes to writing a teenage character. You have the jock, you have the geek or nerd, you have the popular girl, you have the new kid, and then you have the bully. Always in writing teenage characters, and writing any characters really, your goal is to make them less of a type and more of an individual. Freaks and Geeks is a fantastic school television series that launched the careers of James Franco, Seth Rogen, Jason Segel, and what it does is it steps into those stereotypes, but then I think it also pushes beyond them. For one, there's kind of a movement between these categories. Lindsay is this star mathlete, but she tries to transition out of that and tries to become more of, say, a rebellious teenager. Another good thing to do is just to add an event that sort of breaks the stereotype in some way. Bill Haverchek is a total geek. The way he looks, the way he talks. He wants to be an athlete, but he definitely isn't. But then we get to more specific stuff, like he really loves the TV show Dallas, and he is deathly allergic to peanuts. And he manages somehow to make out with the head cheerleader. So the more details that you continue to add about a character, the less they seem like a stereotype, and the more they seem like an actual actual real human being. Now, this next one is a mistake that gets brought up probably the most when talking about how to write teenagers, and it's also the one that vexes older people the most, and it's number 7, butchering the lingo. It is difficult to capture how teenagers talk because on one hand, if you add in too many slang words and of the moment words, one, it's gonna seem cheesy, and then two, it's more of a
how do you do, fellow kids?
So 6 very quick observations on this. 1, remember that some teenagers don't talk a lot, especially to parental figures. And if you have them being super chatty, well, you have to establish that in your character or else it'll feel odd. 2, if you want your book to feel evergreen, you probably want less slang so it doesn't appear hopelessly jaded, say 3 years from now or 5 years from now. In the book, Field Guide to the North American Teenager, there is a character who gets a semicolon tattoo, which apparently used to mean, oh, it means a suicide survivor. But some of the younger generation reading this might not know that. Maybe that was like old school slang and now they don't use that slang. 3, you want to watch out for dialogue that is either too formal or too adultish. So what you should do is listen to the dialogue of teenagers around you and actually transcribe it to capture those nuances, to capture the flows, to capture the filler words, and really make your dialogue resemble what's happening in real life. 4, just remember the little slang goes a long way. Look at Angie Thomas in The Hate U Give. She's using phrases like bougie and no shade and OMG, and it's a mix of black vernacular, slang, and then pop culture references. But I think what she does is she uses that language as a way to distinguish between the two worlds that the character is living in. 1, her poor lower class neighborhood, and 2, this very rich upper class school that she's going to. 5, there's always the option to make up your own slang. In M.T. Anderson's Feed, this is a book that has futuristic slang like null for boring, and youch is a blend of yikes and ouch, and then a word like Meg is an intensifier, like, oh, she was Meg blushing. And just remember that for period timepieces, stories set 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, using dated slang actually helps orient the reader to what time period this is. The 8th mistake that you most definitely want to avoid is oversimplifying social pressure. So if you want to be an absolutely terrible writer, then you should 1, forget about social pressure entirely rather than having it be like a very huge part of these characters' lives. 2, only showing social pressure from their friend group and not realizing there's all these other people at high school or sports or whatever that are also putting pressure on them. And 3, not having the character think about what other people think at all. I mean, that is truly a rare teenage character who can avoid all feeling of social pressure. Most actions and thoughts as a teenager are filtered heavily through what their peers will think. People who love them, people who hate them, potential romantic partners, and just sort of the general peer populace. Let's look at Eleanor and Park by Rainbow Rowell. So this is a book where the plot is entirely dependent upon peer pressure from others. She is bullied because of her red hair, because of her weight, and because of poor hygiene. And then Park is picked on because he's half Korean. Plus, they hide their relationship because they're worried of what their peers will think and or do if they find out that these two characters are dating. The 9th and final mistake that you want to avoid as a writer of teenage characters is forgetting about the search for identity. So teenagers are in this unique space where they're just forming who they are as a person. Do not forget to show that process happening, and also don't forget the plasticity of it. It could be one person one day and then have this major change and change to something else a couple months later. And don't forget about major identity markers. Stuff like clothing and music are so key as they're trying to figure out, like, who am I as a person? A great book that shows you how to do this is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This is a story of twin identical sisters who are struggling to get some identity apart from one another. I have twin boys, so I definitely understand the struggle that they go through in this book. Now, they're also dealing with racial identity. They're both very light-skinned black, and one of them passes for white for a long time. And aside from racial identity, they're also struggling with class identity. So don't forget to have your characters wrestle with those and who do they want to be. Please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and happy writing.